Hi, everybody. I put together a little presentation in order to help everyone choose a good photo to be used in my class, Design from Photo to Imagination. I'll give you a few hints, and then I'm going to go over some of the photos that students submitted and give you pros and cons about the photos. And then I'm going to show you some of my art quilts with photos and talk about how I address some of these issues. So, what to look for in your photo. These are just some of the things you might consider. You'd like to have a foreground, midground, and background in your photo. You'd like to have interesting sight lines or angles instead of just a flat, straight across view, maybe of a mountain and a lake, something that's really straight. If you have sight lines and angles, that'll make your image more interesting. You'd like subjects that can be simplified. You'd like something that would show interesting time of day and a strong light source. That's always really helpful to help you pick your values. And of course, a nice range of values. Things to avoid, especially in your very first project, are large masses of trees in the foreground. You don't want that to be your main focus of your image, is a bunch of trees in the foreground, unless they're like dead trees or mostly trunks and shapes like that without a lot of foliage. I'd like everyone to avoid sunrise or sunset, although those interesting colors and shapes could be done with the turned edge approach that we use for the foreground elements. It's not really practical for your first piece to use that for the fussy piece sky. So I'd like everyone to do something that would just have a plain blue sky and not consider clouds or sunrise or sunset. You also want to avoid very, very busy scenes. If you have a scene you really like, you might try cropping the image. And you want to avoid lines in the image that will draw your viewer out of the picture. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and then I'm going to share some of the photos. Okay, so these photos are in no particular order. Once I got them all in a folder, the different people that submitted them, they may be all mixed up. So this photo of these windmills is kind of interesting. It does have a nice line, diagonal line that goes across the image to a vanishing point where the windmills get smaller and smaller. But it does lead your eye away from what would be the focus of the main windmill. I would suggest if you were using a picture like that, for sure you would want to crop it and maybe bring some kind of larger foreground image into the picture that come in from the left to kind of lead your eye back in, unless what you were going for was really a vanishing point like that. This photo would work well for this class, although you do have to really simplify those palm tree leaves. You'd probably simplify each one down into maybe 5 leaves with very simple kinds of shapes. The angles are really nice coming in from both sides, and I think you would have some nice shapes there in both the shadows in the sand and the water. Plus, you'd have lots of blue sky. Although it is difficult to eventually set in a lot of cutout shapes that those leaves would be in the end. So I'd suggest maybe getting rid of some of those palm trees and working with maybe a simpler photo. This is a really interesting image of this shadow of the bicycle, but it would not work for this technique. You need large blocky shapes. My technique is what I call bold graphic landscape. It's not a super realistic or photorealistic landscape technique. There's other teachers that teach that. Mine is really boils down to really simplifying your image into large shapes where you can turn the edges and then piece it back together. And so all of these skinny lines of this shadow would not really work very well. Also, you pretty much just have 2 areas of that ground. One is very, very plain, and then one has some interesting potholes. But I think it would be hard to impart what that was to your viewer. And this image of this neat shadow might be better utilized in some other kind of application, maybe as a silkscreen image over a hand-painted piece of fabric or something like that. This image would probably work for the class if you really simplified it down to maybe one boat, maybe the yellow one on the right coming in. I think the horizontal boat and then the man holding the paddle is really good. You don't want to have people as your foreground elements with a ton of detail because you just won't be able to capture that detail. But you could simplify that man's shape into just a couple of different shapes, as well as the boat and the paddle, and it would really read as a man out there in the water. And then you've got a few shapes in the background of the islands. You might want to have a few others. So I think this really would have, you'd have to draw a lot of interesting shapes in your water to make that successful because you don't have a lot of mountains there in the background. This one, some of them turn out small, some big. This one would be very difficult to do. There's a lot going on in this photo. There's a whole lot of detail in those buildings and the reflections. Although if you just wanted to get maybe just one little part of the buildings and concentrate on the bridge shapes, that might make an interesting piece, but it would still, you'd have to work pretty hard on it, I think, to make the reflections be successful and to make sure your viewer understood what they were looking at. So I think, you know, you could work with this, but I think it would be challenging. Let's see this one. Now, this is a good example of where foreground trees might be easy to do and make them read well because there's just a couple, one with, you know, pretty full branches and one that's kind of just a straight trunk with just a little bit of bushy branches. However, I think if you're trying to impart that that's a waterfall in the background, it would come out so small and not really be the main focus, although it does draw your eye right down to it. I think you'd have a hard time having your viewer read that that was a waterfall, although it probably would be okay to work with if that's what you really wanted to do. You do have a nice canyon coming in from both sides with some nice shapes of the canyon. This photo is interesting and has a lot of really good lines in the water that are coming across horizontally that kind of are an opposite to those reflections. Sometimes reflections are hard to make successful because in order to make it look as if that water was a little wavy, you might could put tulle or something over the reflection part, or you could change it to being a very, very still pond and make those reflections exactly the mirror image of the upper trees. Although you do have a lot of mass of very, very dark green trees, and it might be a good idea to really simplify that and to draw in a lot fewer trees and then extrapolate what that mountain looks like in the background. You don't have to just trace these pictures exactly how they are or use everything in the picture. The whole idea in this would be to simplify, simplify, simplify. Now this one, rocks are always really good to do with my technique because you can trace a lot of large shapes. You have a lot of clear blue sky. However, you're going to have to work really hard in this one with a lot of different colors of that soft green that's kind of those mossy covered areas at the lower parts of the rocks, in contrast with some of that more vertical. The angles in this picture are really interesting, and I think this, you could really do a good job with this with a lot of different fabrics if you chose your fabrics carefully and divided your shapes carefully, because it does have a lot of interest in the rock shapes. This is another one with the reflection in a completely still pond. And if you crop that down so there wasn't quite as much foreground grasses, you really have some interesting shapes there in the pond. And the little mountain is off to the side instead of in the middle, and the reflection is kind of at an angle. So I think this one would offer, would be a good photo for this class. This one has an interesting, simple tree that could be done in the foreground with some nice rocks. You've got a few little mountain shapes in the background, and you could put some interesting shapes in the water. I don't know that you'd be able to get it to read as plant life there in the water, but it could just be various colors of the water by tracing the different shapes. So this picture would work. Let's see. This one has some nice foreground elements with the this little rock wall in the front. I think there's an awful lot going on here, and it would probably be better to kind of crop it down and just do part of the wall and some of the mountains. You would do the wall in large blocky shapes, and then you would indicate that it's rocks in the wall later on with your quilting stitching. Now, here's another one with some really interesting rock shapes, but it might be a little bit too simple. Although if you divided some of them into, quite a few different sections, and depending on the kinds of fabrics you used, you might be successful with it. This little dab of grass over here indicates that we're standing on a shore looking out, but there's really not much there in the very, very foreground. And you might be able to just add that in your drawing yourself, extrapolate a little bit more, or just leave it out altogether and just have the view just totally going out into the ocean. This is a really, really good photograph for this class. It has diagonal lines leading your eye into the picture, really interesting shapes and colors in the water and the reflections, some nice vertical rocks that are just in contrast to those diagonals coming in with the water, and some really good intense shadows. So this picture is one of the best ones in this grouping I'm showing you that would work really well for this class. This one also would work well, although it's a little bit too busy. There's probably too much going on here, and I would suggest cropping it out, say more like this, where you just have don't have as much of those smaller little ponds in the river, but you've got a really interesting shape of a pond in that river, and then a little bit more water further out into the background, leading your eye through the hills and from the foreground hills out into those very far away background hills. And this one would be a really good one to draw shapes and use for this class. Let's see. This one is probably a little bit too close of a view of those rocks, although they are really interesting. It's straight on, and I think it would be hard for your viewer to understand what they were looking at. You've got the water down there at the bottom and maybe a boat, or maybe that's a wave. You might need something in the foreground to give some scale to that. You do have really interesting rock shapes, but because it's just a straight on view and you're so zoomed in, it might be a little bit hard for your viewer to understand what they were looking at. Now, here's a sunset picture, and I really don't advise anybody doing sunset because I'd like you to learn my fussy piecing technique for the sky. But this does have some interesting diagonals with the sand and the water coming across. And then what leads your eye back into the picture is this strip of land coming in from the side. So you could draw some really nice shapes with this one. And maybe you could add something into the foreground, like a bird. I did that with one of mine, or a sand bucket, or just something to give a little bit of scale to the foreground. You might add something. This is a really interesting picture. It have some nice hard edges with all the shapes of those buildings, but I think it would work well. You've got lots of different shapes, and you can make the shadowy side and the side getting the light. And even though it's a cloudy day, you can arbitrarily decide where your light source is. And again, you would be able to do all of the brick work or that rock work with your quilting stitch later on in the quilting. But because you've got different angles of the buildings and the red roofs and the gray and then the white wall, this one might make a really interesting composition. This is another good one. You've got that little lighthouse up there. I'd crop that in and get rid of some of that that's on the left and just have mostly the shape of the lighthouse and the rocks. You've got some nice separate rock shapes at the bottom showing some nice hard shadows, and you could add some other hard shadows into the whitish part of the rock by arbitrarily when you draw your shapes. And I think that piece would work well. You've got the horizontal ocean and then the vertical lighthouse, and so that would make a really strong composition. Here's one I'll have to show you in one of my pieces, how I handle this kind of a tree. There's really not much going on here except the tree. There's the ocean's kind of there in the background, but it's really, really small. And I would say that you kind of need a little bit more going on in the midground and the background. The tree Trees are very challenging, and I wouldn't suggest doing just a tree. You kind of need a little bit more things going on in the background. It's also going to be like the palm trees I mentioned. If you did something like this, then you've got to piece all that tree shape into that blue sky. So that would be a little bit more challenging. Here's another one with a sunset with some nice angles, nice, really pretty reflections there in the water, which would be really successful as shapes. This is one, if you were going to do it, I'd say not to do my pieced fussy piece sky, but to utilize those shapes in the water and those shapes in the sky in the turned edge technique. This one's a little bit better because the previous one, your eye kind of goes right off the page there following the water. This one, the trees kind of push you back in, and you could easily crop out that, that little dock, and you could have a really interesting picture here. And really, if you just wanted to do the sky in just one color of red-orange, a gradation fabric in red-orange, you could do the fussy piecing and have the, use this main foreground to draw interesting shapes. You might want to get rid of some of this bushy tree stuff over here and simplify some of that. There is a lot of really, really dark shapes there. This one I would say is a no-go. This is way too much detail in the shape of the Statue of Liberty that you would not be able to accomplish that with this particular technique. It would be much better done in a different kind of applique technique. This is an interesting picture because the little log fence is, it would be a really nice foreground element. The only problem is it draws your eye right off the page, and it just disappears out here where it intersects the ocean. And so from a design standpoint, that would not be a very, very good composition because it just does draw you right off the page. Let's see. This one is one that I would say is way too busy to be able to use in this particular technique. The bright bougainvillea or whatever that is in the front, the big blotchy flowers is you can indicate that kind of flower in this applique, in this turned edge piece technique, but it's really large blocky shapes without much detail. It's usually better as a mid-ground element rather than a foreground element. And that particular kind of palm tree that's really dense would be really hard to extrapolate in this technique. So I would not advise using this photo. This one with some palm trees, if you simplified this into just one or two palm trees where you could separate out those leaves, like I said in the earlier palm tree picture, you could draw some really interesting shapes in the rocks, and you could have one set of colors for these closer gray rocks, and then another set of blues and whites for your background rocks. So that one would work. But again, this be a similar situation with too many palm trees, and it would just need to be simplified. So less palm trees, and probably you'd want to try to draw that so that some of these trees actually show that they're on the ground and not just cut off like they are in these pictures. So you might have to do some extrapolating. Here's a nice simple one with a few palm trees that, again, you could simplify those palm trees and get some really nice shapes in these mountains and hills. But I think you would want to leave out that building since it's just chopped off with this fence and all you have is a roof. You might put a different building in there where you could actually show the entire building and then move the palm trees off to the left so they weren't smack dab in the middle. And I think using a couple of different photos, you could make a nice composition. This one is one of these where you've just got a big mass of bushy green trees in the foreground, and you'd never be able to show that kind of detail in what that would be in this particular way that I do my class. And also these straight on views of those mountains just straight behind the trees, that really doesn't make for a very interesting composition. Again, you've got these really nice mountains in the background that you could get nice shapes from, but this particular building or house, that's just a wall you're looking at. So if you wanted to do a composition like that, I'd say find some other kind of building to substitute for that house to put in the foreground with the mountains in the background. Now, this is an interesting one. This tree would be, this is one of the better challenges. So this was my first national park poster quilt. And you see, I've got all that big bushy tree foreground stuff. I just artificially drew that into a whole bunch of different shapes and used a lot of different greens. This is a poster style, so it's not a truly representational style. And pretty much what you see there in the finished quilt is just the idea of green bushes on both sides of the path. You'll see this one, I used a lot of those gradation fabrics in my big, large, blocky shapes in the rock. And because I used the gradation fabrics, there's a whole lot more motion and movement and depth in that big rock of Angel's Landing than there is if you just use solids. And then, of course, just the simple blue sky. This next one that I did of Big Bend, the original photograph there on the left, and you can tell that I cropped it down because I usually work in a vertical orientation, and that the focus was the shape of that river, the Rio Grande River, and those interesting shapes of those mountains that were far in the distance. So again, just like the Zion quilt, I took those big shapes of that grassy area and just totally simplified them. Gave an artificial light source so that the light was coming from the left and made the ones on the right, the grassy spots on the right, a little bit lighter and a little bit darker on the left. And then as you go into the distance, those mountain shapes are pretty much just single pieces of fabric without much detail at all, because as the mountains recede, you lose the ability to see any kind of detail. But the main focus there is the interesting shape of the water. This one I took from an interesting angle. I sat down on the ground and tried to shoot up so that cactus was in front of that little rock formation. So I have a really nice foreground element of the cactus and then the midground or background area of that rock sticking up into the blue sky. Any kind of rock formation sticking up in the blue sky works really well for this technique. Now, the next one I'm going to show you is where I started combining photos. This is going to be of Wrangell St. Elias National Park, and I wanted to incorporate in my poster both the glacier, and so on the left there you see the mountain, you see the glacier, that brown and black hill there that looks like it's on the other side of the ice. That is ice, that's a moraine, and a moraine is part of the glacier that's ice and rock together, and it's absolutely enormous. And then on the right, you see the buildings of the Kennecott Copper Mine. That's a National Historic Monument that's in Wrangell St. Elias National Park. And it's an old copper mill from the 1920s. And so even though those two things are not seen exactly in the same photograph, you can work your design to incorporate both. And I like doing that in a poster quilt because a poster is supposed to entice people to come visit a place. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly one picture that you're trying to copy. So here again, when I designed Glacier Bay, you may not always have all the photos that you need. So my photograph of Glacier Bay National Park is up there on the top left. And then I, of course, had a few pictures of whales, but mine were terrible pictures. So I went on unsplash.com where you can get completely copyright-free images to use in your artwork. And so I got those pictures of the whale and the whale's tail and added those into that foreground area because that was going to have way too much ocean leading up to those mountains in the distance because of working in a vertical orientation is very difficult for designing. This is one of these canyons called Black Canyon of the Gunnison. It's in Colorado, and it's very, very dark. It doesn't get much sun. It's very narrow. It's 2,000 feet deep. And so you can see what I did there with the rock shapes. The canyon is steeper on the left than on the right. So I clearly indicated that in my finished quilt. And then I used lots of different colors, going to lighter, more grayed out colors going back in order to show the depth and of the canyon and to make an interesting piece. Don't be afraid to be colorful. We work in fabric for a reason. And like I said, this is not a photo representational class. You want to make a pretty picture and a good composition and not necessarily be exactly true to your photo. I'm showing you this one to show you how I did address one of those sunsets. And after I'd done 4 or 5 of these pieces, it was very challenging. Instead of one gradation fabric, I used 4 gradation fabrics, but I pieced it the same way that you'll learn in my class. Here's one of the ways that I would address trees. So if you see those trees in the foreground, there's a lot more detail in those, but there's still big blocky shapes. And as you go back in the distance to the midground, you see that the trees are shapes with just a little bit of pointiness to them. You really can't do a whole lot of pointy trees in this turned edge technique. And for just a little bit of color, maybe in the rhododendrons, I have a few little roundy shapes of the pink. But again, I don't want to really put those in the foreground elements where you would expect to see detail because you just wouldn't be able to get it. This one I'm showing you so that you can see that tree there in the finished piece, that most of the foreground in front of that arch was just a big mass of bushy green trees. And I decided that that would be very difficult to incorporate into this image. And so that's why I made all of those blocks showing different items that are shown in this National Conservation Area. This was a commission piece, and I hand drew all those embroidery designs and the block print designs based on things that I saw in that park. And so use those blocks to kind of be in the place of all that bushy green trees. But then I did the one tree that had a more interesting open kind of trunk with open sets of foliage, and just did them sort of in a clumpy area, and got rid of the main bushy stuff. So I hope this has been a help to you in trying to evaluate your photos for this class. And I look forward to seeing everybody really soon.